Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
Episode 63, and we're off and running. And Carm, you said something that I never hear you say. You just said, I'm feeling a little blue. I don't know why, which is interesting because I just got off the phone with my lovely, beautiful, gorgeous, stunning, enigmatic wife, Ileana Diaz, who says she's not feeling well either. She feels a little down, mainly because she doesn't like to work. But Carm, what's your sitch? Why are you feeling blue?
Never mind. I don't feel like going into self-analysis and I'm perfectly fine. My throat is scratchy a little. I'm wondering what happened.
And you were telling me that your mother, may she rest in peace, always used to tell you when you weren't feeling well that you must be coming down with something.
Correct, because it's not a normal state.
And I, just so you know, not to compete, but I got back from a quick weekend trip, which is always fun with 3 children, for 48 hours to Los Angeles.
And you had to. It was a happy occasion.
Last night, my nose was running and my feet smelled, which means I must be built upside down. It's an old joke I heard. But I took a COVID test and it came back negative because I did not want to infect my mother. But since you don't want to talk about your feelings, let me go ahead. So
I'll talk.
No,
I'll talk about my feelings.
No, let me talk. So listen, I was thinking about this seriously last night. I'm in an existential crisis. The issue is, I think it started during my bar mitzvah.
I was going to ask, is it a chronic long-term existential crisis?
And what's interesting,
or a very sudden one?
Ever since we had the therapist to the stars, Barry Michaels, on, typically what I do when I get home at 12:30, 1 in the morning, is I just need to vegetate and get my mind off of things. So I will sit. A show that I love is Night Watch. It follows the New Orleans EMS. And you see these things like compound fractures, bones sticking out of legs, and how they take care of people. And it really relaxes me for some strange reason.
Sick reason.
Or I watch Dateline. But since Barry Michaels, I don't feel comfortable, and I feel this constant nagging. So you know what I did last night? I wrote.
Oh my God, it's worked. I have to write to Barry. I always thought he was clever, smart, but I forgot to bring his book to show today.
Well, Barry Michaels he's a therapist to the stars.
He wrote the book, The Tools.
The Tools.
The Tools. It really is a very new way and very good way of looking at. Actually, it's not new. It was published in 2010, but it's a new concept where he.
So, Carm, what I'm trying to do, and I've told the audience this before, and I hope they think it's a good idea. I'm trying to write a companion book to the podcast called Surviving the Survivor: Conversations About Life with My Holocaust Survivor Mom. And so I've been writing, and last night I did not feel like writing, and I said to myself, I'm going to write for 20 minutes. And for some reason, I'm very clear-headed at night. But this is what I came to in writing last night, is the following. I'm having an existential crisis. As you know, my kids go to a Jewish day school. There are at least literally 10 billionaires. So on the one hand, who go there. Now, on the one hand, in life, money is important. So it's like, do I need money? Do I need success? Do I need happiness? And the answer is sort of, I need all three. But the most
you want all three. You don't need all three.
But the important thing to me is creativity and doing something that I enjoy doing. Now, you always push me toward my quote unquote business, which is called Content Partners. And that's where
Wait a minute. Wait a second. I have to open a parenthesis.
Yeah.
I only point out to you when you lament that all your neighbors live in $20 million houses and have boats.
Well, it's true.
It's boats and blah, 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 blah. And that you are the poor kid on the block. I say to you, well, that's all they do. They hustle for money. You are
the guy
into
that created
creativity.
The guy that created WeWork is in my kid's kindergarten class. He's worth $2.5 billion.
Oh, now it will be all Jews are rich. You just happen to live in an area like that.
I'm not keeping up with the Joneses. I'm keeping up with the Greenblatts.
You know the next street right next street to you, there are very modest homes and very modest
Well, I got
people.
in the nick of time. But anyway, this is not about homes or this or that or the other thing. This is about 52 years old, and I'm still trying to decide. It doesn't get easier.
Joel said I should be comforting and not what?
I said, if you are pushy, it causes paralysis with me.
Pushy paralysis.
You see, you didn't push me last night, and I wrote, if you pushed me, I would have been in a state of paralysis.
But Joel, I made a resolution. I'm working on it. I will not push you in any area.
But now that you comforted me, I was able to write last night. But here's my question. Does one...
By the way, I don't need to have a $20 million house or a boat. I mean, God forbid I would get a boat. I would hate it as hell. But even a $20 million
I mean, the other
house,
dude in my girls' kindergarten class, literally, the movie Jerry Maguire was based on him.
All right. You are unbelievably unfortunate that you live in such a neighborhood.
Well, no, I'm just saying, like, how am I supposed to compete with this? It's impossible.
Who wants you to compete?
So here's my question.
Be yourself.
So what brings me happiness is when I wrote last night, I felt good. I felt really good. I felt cleansed. I felt spiritually healed, if you will.
You see?
But it didn't provide, I can't pay the mortgage with that. So what do I do? That's my existential crisis. That's my question.
You
by the way,
we're out for yourself.
By the way, we're going to institute a new segment on this show, and we're going to get it trending, called #YoCarm. Instead of Dear Abby of the 1970s, where people would write in, it's going to be #YoCarm, and you can ask Carm, a licensed therapist, questions. Are you down to do that, Carm?
I'm up to do that.
So the #YoCarm is, do I go after the money or do I go after the creative happiness?
Joel, who the hell can decide? Let me tell you something. When our daughter was studying for her, to make the long story short, somehow this story came up from the Talmud about Rabbi Zusia. And Rabbi Zusia died. Wait a second, was he dying? And they said to him, they will, when you get to the pearly gates, you will never be asked, Rabbi Zusia, why weren't you like Moses or like this or like that? They will ask you, why weren't you more faithful and truthful to Zusia? If you are Zusia, you can only be Zusia, okay? And if you are Joel, you have to sort it out and decide for Joel. And if you have a dilemma with this till the end of your life, you have a dilemma with this till the end of your life. There are no neat bows on packages.
Neat bows is what you said? Okay.
Yes. You want to translate it for others?
Well, anyway, we'll continue to work out my existential crisis. But since you and Ileana are both feeling down, here's a story to lift you up.
Let's not exaggerate. I don't feel down in your definition of down. I feel in my definition of down.
Well, listen.
By the way, my throat hasn't hurt since we started talking.
To cheer you up, we have a fascinating story tonight, and it revolves around a guy named Dan Markel. Went to Harvard. You ever hear of Harvard? He went to Harvard Law School. He went to Harvard undergrad. He was a legal scholar. He was working right here at Florida State University.
In Tallahassee.
In Tallahassee, the state capital. And he was murdered in 2014. And when you find out...
Don't give away who the murderer was.
Coming up next is one of his best friends, I believe, from Harvard. His name
Who did not kill him.
No, did not kill him. His name is Jason Solomon, and he's coming up on the Main Schmooze to break down this story, find out all the twists and turns, and there is a Brandeis University connection.
And allegedly, Joel, who watches Dateline, saw it on Dateline.
And 2020, been on both. And we will be right back with the Main Schmooze with Jason Solomon on the Dan Markel murder.
Do you want to help my son? His company, Content Partners Media, specializes in brand video and content creation for innovative companies and others. Please go to www.contentpartnersmedia.com and hire him. I repeat, please go to www.contentpartnersmedia.com.
Welcome back to Surviving the Survivor. It's time now for the Main Schmooze.
So, Karim, we are about to dive into a really sad and sort of deviant and upsetting story. Something you're familiar with as a former therapist, but this is at a whole different level. Are you mentally prepared for this?
Yeah.
You are.
Yeah, I usually don't watch true crime, and I don't dwell in it.
Well, you know, I've seen every single Dateline ever produced, every 2020, so I'm actually kind of familiar with the story, but not completely up to date. But let me tell the audience a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, and then we'll introduce Jason Solomon after that, who is a good friend of the murder victim. But without further ado, in 2014, Dan Markel, a law professor at Florida State University, who was the loving father of two young boys, a proud Jew, you'll be happy to know, Carmela, he was brutally murdered in his Tallahassee driveway, which is obviously the capital of Florida. And that was right after he dropped his boys off at daycare. Compelling evidence laid out by police and prosecutors pointed to hitmen hired by Dan Markel's in-laws family, who are the Adelsons, who are from Coral Springs, Florida, which is Broward County. You might wonder why. Why would someone ever want to do this? Well, the motive, legal experts say, is the Adelsons' desperate desire to have their daughter, Wendi Adelson, who was the former wife of Dan, and we'll sort this all out because it's a little confusing. The motive was to have Wendi Adelson, the mother, and the grandchildren live closer to the in-laws, and there was also a imminent court hearing at the time that threatened to limit Dan's mother-in-law's, Dana, I believe her name, her unsupervised access to the kids. So things were ramping up back in 2014. The two hitmen from South Florida were tried and convicted. One is going to be spending life in prison. The other got a plea deal. And just last month, Charle Adelson, who is the brother of the former wife, there's Wendi Adelson, the sister, who went to Brandeis, my alma mater, nothing to be proud of there, and the brother, Charle Adelson, he was arrested and charged in connection with the murder. This is 8 years after the fact. This just happened. There's now an other woman who's involved. Her name is Katherine Magbanua, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is very convoluted, so we'll go back through it. She was Charle Adelson's girlfriend, the brother's girlfriend, but she was also the mother of two of the hitmen, one of the hitmen's children, if we can follow this. She just went on trial, I believe, this week for murder as well. So there is a lot going on, but the big news here is that Charle Adelson, the brother of the murder victim's wife, was just arrested and charged with murder, and he's going to be going on trial shortly. They believe the mother, Charlie's mother, and Wendy's mother was also involved, and we're going to get into that right now. But now we welcome to the show Jason Solomon, who runs a website called Justice for Dan, who's an old friend of Dan Markel's and wants to make sure that justice is meted out in this case. So, Jason, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Good to be here with you and appreciate your attention to this important and tragic case. So
let's start kind of with the latest. Was I correct about the fact that this woman, Katherine Magbanua, did her trial start this week? And what is she charged with?
Yeah, it did. That trial is underway. By the time this airs, this will probably be the trial will be coming to a close. She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. And she is essentially charged with, and it's fairly clear that she was the middle person essentially between the Adelson family and the hitmen. So the two men who went and drove from South Florida up to Tallahassee, their names are Garcia and Rivera, and killed my friend Dan Markel. They have no connection themselves to Dan Markel. They have no reason to have him dead. But they do have a connection, which is one of the hitmen, Garcia, is essentially the common law husband he has two kids with, this woman named Katherine Magbanua. And Katherine Magbanua, at the time of the murder, was apart from Garcia and was dating Charle Adelson, Wendy's brother, Dan's ex-wife. So that's the only possible connection between Garcia and Rivera. It's been 8 years, and no one's come up with any possible other connection between the hitmen and Dan Markel. So it's fairly clear that this woman, Katherine Magbanua, who's now on trial, was the intermediary, the middle person between the hitmen and the Adelson family, who wanted Dan gone because of this contentious divorce.
Now let's go back in time. So you obviously knew Dan well. Paint a portrait, if you will, the kind of person he was, the kind of the joie de vivre that he had. He was also a great legal mind. Let the audience know a little bit about him as a human.
Sure. So I met Dan when both of us were starting our careers as law professors. This is around maybe 2005, 2006. I started at the University of Georgia. He started at Florida State. And he was a great connector. So even though we were at different schools, he was very good at sort of building networks of legal scholars and teachers all over the country who could learn from one another, who could read each other's work and make each other better. So I would see him at conferences, both nationally and in the Southeast, in Florida, and at Georgia. And he was just a guy who really, first of all, he cared a lot about his work. He cared a lot about making the legal system better, at understanding the legal system, and really wanted his research and other people's research to be as good as possible. He was very generous with his time in that way. He loved to connect people. He loved his kids. He loved being a dad. He had got so much joy from being with his two boys, and he didn't want to miss a minute. And, like a lot of people, I knew him soon after he got married, and like a lot of people, there's a honeymoon period after marriage. Carmen, you can probably speak to this more as a therapist, but certainly in the first 5 years of marriage, when I knew them, Dan and Wendi were quite happy together. They were quite affectionate with one another, and of course, with every marriage, really after 6 or 7 years, 5, 6, 7 years, things get tougher. And he was going through some tough things in his marriage. And, frankly, we got to know each other professionally, but we actually bonded personally because each of us were actually going through some similar things in our marriages. And that's how I really got close to Dan.
Carm, you're the exception. 61 years and counting, and you live in bliss, Carm, except for the last 6 months.
You don't. If you are married to a law professor, it's one thing. If you're married to a psychiatrist, as I am, then it's easier.
You can dump your problems on your husband. So
or vice versa.
Let's go back to this fateful day. It's July 2014. Dan has been married for a while, obviously. He goes on a typical day to drop off his kids. And what happens when he returns home?
Yeah, so this is, so in 2014, July 2014, he's been now divorced for about a year. So they were separated maybe for a little bit before then. He's been divorced for about a year. They have settled in the divorce, although...
Let me jump in for 1 second, because it was a particularly cold, cruel way that Wendi, acrimonious way that Wendi went around about this. So Wendi, according to what I have read and learned, basically told Dan she was not happy in the marriage and didn't give him a whole lot of heads up. And one day he comes home to basically pretty much an empty house. Everything was moved out. And on the mattress of the crib were divorce papers. And that's essentially how he found out that his wife was leaving him, right?
She's also a lawyer.
She is a lawyer, correct.
So she knew the legal.
Well, she went to Brandeis. She has to be either a lawyer or a doctor. So you had a 50% chance, Carm. But yeah, so
that's right. That's right. I will say that that it wasn't out of nowhere in the sense that they were working on their marriage. They were seeing a couples counselor, like you, Carm. And they were trying to work on it. And I think Dan thought there was still a path forward. So, that's kind of where they were. And she decided at a certain point, as people sometimes do, that she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't go forward with the marriage. And that's when she filed divorce papers.
And Jason, what was your impression of her? And you can be brutally honest with us. I mean, you met her, correct? I mean, what did you think of her? And I mean, did you see anything alarming about her or her behavior?
No, I didn't. I mean, I didn't know her real well, but I got to know her a bit, at some of these conferences. And, I spoke at Florida State a few times and saw her then and went over to the house and, had dinner with them. And I had a positive impression of her. I think, she seemed like a smart, friendly, witty person. Many of Dan's friends, most of Dan's friends, I think, thought she was very good for him. They, again, as I said, for the first several years of marriage, seemed to have a very good relationship. I do think there was something that Dan would occasionally, mention, and that I got to know more about after the divorce was, her family was a bit more difficult, and Dan did have a good relationship with the older brother, who is the one who is not implicated in any of this wrongdoing. In fact, he has spoken out, in a sense, for truth and justice and against his family. So Dan actually had a good relationship with him, but had a more difficult relationship with the others. And, Dan would say to me I knew Wendi had a close relationship with her mother. And Dan would say to me occasionally, Wendi they were never quite able to cut the umbilical cord. And so, this question of people's relationship with their parents and getting the appropriate level of closeness and distance can be tough. And I think Wendi was quite close to her mother, and that could create unfortunate dynamics in the relationship.
Carm, that just made me very nervous.
Don't personalize it. Let's move on.
I have not been able to cut the umbilical cord. Hopefully there's nothing untoward that happens. By the way, I like to test my mother to see if she's done her homework. Carm, do you know how Wendi, spells it with an I at the end, Wendi, and Dan Markel, do you know how they met?
How they met?
How did they meet, Carm?
She was his student.
On JDate. You did not do your homework, Carmela.
I tried.
Caught you red-handed.
I
caught
tried.
you red-handed. So he's a nice Jewish boy from Toronto. There was an interesting, and we're going to get to the day of the murder in a minute.
And she's a beautiful woman from what I saw. Yeah. She was very attractive at that time.
There was something that kind of raised red flags for me as a sweet Jewish boy. So the day of their marriage, I'm sure you know this story, the day of their wedding, I should say, Dan, who was kind of observant in his way, had some religious people, and they wanted a kosher wedding. And the Adelsons, I believe, paid for a large portion of the wedding, as a lot of times the bride's family does. And when they got to the wedding, there was milk and meat, and it wasn't kosher. And Dan was kind of, I don't want to say humiliated, but he was taken aback. That right there is to me, is a little odd. I would have raised a red flag.
Oh, please. It's not odd. It happens all the time.
You don't have a code? I don't know. It's a little passive-aggressive. So I
think
don't know.
We are reading into that.
We're reading into it too much. Okay, so I'll stop there. But so back to July 2014. Dan now is in the process of a separation, a divorce. He has, I believe, 2 children at that point, right, Jason?
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Yeah, and he goes to drop them off at daycare in Tallahassee, and then heads back home, and tell the audience what happens at that point.
So he's on the phone with someone, and he says to that person, hold on a minute, there's someone in my driveway. And, we can infer from the fact that he said there's someone in my driveway that you didn't really know who it was. And this person shot him right through the windshield and killed him. And he was killed right there as he pulled into his garage.
What is fabulous to me, I am not into detective stories, but what's fabulous to me,
you're always into detective stories. It's weird that you make these like claims that are totally not true. You're obsessed with detective stories. But what's interesting to you?
No, I'm not.
No, you are.
Okay, we'll clarify this later. But what's amazing to me, what impressed me, is that car is the clue, right? The car that those two men from Miami drove.
Carm, you love to jump ahead of the story. We didn't get there yet. So the case goes cold. People don't know who did this, why it was done. They immediately call Wendi in for an interrogation, and you see that it's obviously public record. And I mean, I have to say, in looking at that objectively, she looks totally, at least in my opinion, she looks very genuinely upset, right? In that interrogation video. But she even says that she was having some issues with her husband. And at one point, and I don't believe it was this very first interrogation, but at one point down the road, she even says that for her divorce present, her brother Charlie, who has now been charged and arrested, at one point he even said to her, look, for your divorce present, I got you this TV set because hiring a hitman would have been too expensive, right, Jason? And she mentions that to police, correct?
She mentions that to police very early on. And yes, she mentions that to police, I believe, in that first interrogation. That's right.
Which is interesting, and we're going to get to this too. But at first, Jason wrote some blogs about this, and I read Jason's blogs because I do homework even after I work my day job, Carm, and I get home at 12:30, and then I work on the book that I'm working on. So I went to bed at 3:30 in the morning last night. But Jason, who wrote a blog about this, said that initially he did not think that Wendi, the wife, had anything to do with this. But later on, a couple years later, you changed your tune on that. And one of the reasons you give is that she mentioned this story about the TV and how it was cheaper than hiring a hitman. And I think your argument is that she was a lawyer and legally could kind of have given herself some sort of fabricated immunity by mentioning that.
So I was initially, I thought that, like you, because of how she seemed genuinely surprised, by what we were, by the news that her ex-husband had been killed, that she couldn't have done it. And I thought that she was genuinely surprised. I also thought that if she had really planned this with her family, if she had really planned this with her brother and perhaps the rest of her family, she would not have pointed the finger at her brother like that. In other words, she really, without prompting, said right out, hey, my brother Charlie looked into hiring a hitman. Not only that, she told her boyfriend at the time, she was dating someone, she had told him just the week before that her brother had looked into hiring a hitman. So either it was, it seemed very strange to me that if it was true that she was in on it and she had planned it, that she would essentially point everybody right to her brother. That seemed like a very risky thing to do on her part if she had really planned it, because then wouldn't her brother just turn on her? And it also seemed kind of certainly a disloyal thing to do, right? If her brother had really killed her ex-husband ostensibly to help her out in some way, although we could talk about that. It seemed strange to me that she would essentially throw him under the bus right away. And that's basically what she did.
But then why did you, you changed, you had a change of heart, right? And now you do think she was involved. So what was it that flipped that switch for you?
Well, there were a few things. I think the main thing was that at trial, it became clear to me, and frankly, some others had pointed to this evidence beforehand, that she had driven by at around the time of the murder, just after the murder, she drove by Dan's house. So she drove by the place where the murder took place. Now, at the time, she lived in an apartment on the other side of town. She claimed that she was just in the neighborhood because she was going to a liquor store to pick up a bottle of bourbon for a friend, and she was going to meet for lunch. But folks who are more familiar with Tallahassee than I am say that it's quite implausible that if she were going to a liquor store from her apartment on the other side of town, that she would have gone right by there. And even if she was going to a liquor store near there, it doesn't make sense that she turned down the very street where Dan lived. And so that was one thing. The other thing is, I came to think that it was almost too much of a coincidence, or that is, it was too much of a coincidence that she told her boyfriend just the week before that her brother had looked into hiring a hitman. It's too much of a coincidence. It's too much of a coincidence that she said that. In other words, it must have been intentional that she decided, perhaps in a moment of panic about the whole thing. Obviously, if she was involved, she couldn't have had a great emotional state about killing her ex-husband, that she must have, perhaps in an attempt to deflect attention to her, that she was the one who had planned the murder, pointed the finger at her brother.
What is the kind of the presumption about her driving by the house the day of? Is it your contention that she was looking to see if the job had been done yet, or if the hitmen were at the house, or what was the point of her driving by that day?
Not sure. Had it been done? Were the police there? Was he dead? Not clear, but something like that. And look, I've never been 100% sure of anything. Now I think it's more likely. I used to think it was more likely than not that she didn't know about it beforehand. Now I think it's more likely than not that she did. But do I think it's 100% that she was involved beforehand? I don't.
This is the day of the murder or the day after?
The day of.
Day of.
Literally
within day of. I mean, within 30 minutes of him being shot.
Now, let me tell you something. My day job for 25 years, I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to be fair and balanced, as they say, which is why I left that network. But anyway, I can tell you from hearing this story and covering enough of these cases, and you can come sue my ass, Wendi totally knew about this. No way she didn't know about it. The whole family is nutty, and they were in on it. Now, she had a boyfriend, as Jason alluded to. His name was Jeffrey Lacoste. And if you look at photos, it's almost eerie. He almost looks exactly like her ex-husband, Dan. And he gets called in the minute that Dan is murdered back in July 2014. And he tells the cops the Adelson's family hobby was hating Danny. That was literally their hobby. And he mentions to them about what Jason just said, which is that there was some talk about hiring a hitman, which is kind of crazy. But the case remains cold. I don't know if it's for weeks or months, but Carm alluded to this. There is a Prius that comes into play. Someone, I think, in the neighborhood spots something that looks like a hybrid car, and Jason, pick it up from there. So what do the police do, and how do they finally track this car down?
Yeah, so the Tallahassee Police Department, I should say, with some very important involvement from the FBI, it's a good example of law enforcement agencies working together. They get a combination of, I think, maybe a witness, but also, camera footage. As we now know, there are really security cameras everywhere, and so there are security cameras on a bus. There are security cameras at the daycare center where Dan dropped off his kids. And so law enforcement is able to essentially piece together a Prius that is following Dan to the daycare center, through the parking lot, and then back to his house. And that's what they're able to see. And then they're able to, look at all Priuses of that kind that were essentially rented. I'm sure they looked at ownership and they looked at rental, and eventually they found one that was rented by a guy using his own name, named Luis Rivera. And Rivera was one of the hitmen. And they were able to find that car was rented in South Florida.
And that is good old-fashioned police work. It turns out that Luis Rivera, who's one of the two hitmen, he was a member, this is such a Florida story, he was a member of the Latin Kings gang and knew the other hitman, who's now going to spend life in prison. Luis Rivera got some sort of plea deal, but the other guy, Sigfredo Garcia, is going to be spending the rest of his life in prison, as he should. Now, they were able to then, I think, use the Sun Pass, which for people in the East Coast up and down, it's kind of like the Easy Pass, and they were able to track it to these guys, right? Eventually, I mean, they rented the car in their own name, correct?
That's right. That's right.
So the story gets more interesting because now Wendy's brother, Charle Adelson, who was, by the way, Carm, can you wrap your head around a nice Jewish boy? He marries this nice Jewish woman who went to Brandeis, again, my alma mater, and her mother-in-law apparently wants the kids, not in Tallahassee, it's not like they live in Taiwan, they live in Tallahassee. She wants the kids so close to her, and the umbilical cord is so tightly wound that she plans her own son-in-law's murders. I think the mother is involved too, and this is me saying this, not Jason, because I don't know if Jason's on the record as saying that, but I can tell you, is her name Dana, Jason, the mother?
Her name's Dana, yeah.
So there's Dana Adelson and her husband, Harvey Adelson. He's a very prominent dentist, and the son, Charlie, who's now in prison, is going to be able to do dental work in prison because he's a periodontist. But Carm, can you wrap your head around the fact that this nice Jewish family, the Adelsons, hired a hitman to kill their son-in-law? What do you think's going on here from a therapist perspective?
The easy way out is it's a pathological family.
What if I did not move back from Los Angeles? Would you have hired a hitman to kill my wife?
Probably.
Probably. No. I mean, what is going on here pathology-wise, Carmela?
No, listen.
What drive? I mean, what drives a family to be so crazy that they're going to hire a hitman to kill their son?
But that's not the reason. That's not the reason. The reason, it's not that Tallahassee is 6 hours by car. It's probably
400 miles.
It's probably half hour by plane. It's not the reason. The reason is that this family is pathological. And they don't know, you don't know how many generations they are pathological, if already the parents of these
When you say pathological, that's a therapist term. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
No, it's a way out for me to say they are just absolutely
horrible
Looney Tunes. That's all they are, because we are used to people doing it for passion or doing it for money, or doing it for some other motivation. But to have no, that was not the reason, to have the grandchildren closer to them. This must have been a real, I'm sorry, I have to use the word pathology. And it was a familiar pathology. It was like, also, they must have had a lot of money and power, so they thought that, their power was limitless.
So the father...
But I have to ask a question in Badin. We just got a criticism of yours truly that I always interrupt. In the most interesting part of our guests' talk, I interrupt them. So I will ask before, and then I'm not going to interrupt. Explain, why did it take... Now it's 7 years. No, 8 years. Why did it take 8 years to indict the family? Why
the brother-in-law of Dan, the brother
How
of
come
Wendy?
they couldn't find the missing link for that length of time and let these people walk around free? Why? Why did it take 8 years? You don't have to answer it
Yeah,
immediately. You can answer it as you go along with the story, but that's what I'm interested.
I'm happy to answer that. I do though want to get back to I think your important point about this being a pathology and this not being it couldn't really have been that they killed him just to be a little closer to their grandparents.
No.
It is pathology, and I'd like to dig into that. I think it's worth digging into that, what that might be a bit more. But in terms of, look, it's been known to the world really for 6 years. Charle Adelson, Dan's brother-in-law, was arrested just a few weeks ago. It's been known since 2016 that Charle and his mom, Dana, basically planned this whole thing. The Tallahassee Police Department, when they arrested the hitmen, they released what's known as a probable cause affidavit, the document that the Tallahassee Police Department was ready to arrest Charle Adelson, the brother, 6 years ago. So why didn't they? Well, it was a dispute between the prosecutor, the state attorney's office, and the Tallahassee Police Department. Now, the person who's now in charge of the district attorney's office in Tallahassee is different than the one at the time. The one at the time was a guy named Willie Meggs. And Willie Meggs was kind of a real kind of old boy Tallahassee person who, for whatever reason, thought that there wasn't enough evidence, or at least said publicly that there wasn't enough evidence to go after Charle Adelson. There's been speculation, and I've speculated, that a powerful, close family friend of the Adelsons, a man named Peter Weinstein, was the former Senate Majority Leader in Tallahassee in the state legislature. He was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was a contemporary of the DA Willie Meggs. And this is someone who the Adelsons leaned on from time to time, particularly to bail out Charle when Charle got in trouble over here. And I suspect that Weinstein may have, I'm speculating, but I think there's a very good chance that Weinstein may have intervened with the prior district attorney. What happened now, just in the past few months, is that in preparation for this retrial of Katherine Magbanua, the district attorney's office further developed an audio recording and amplified the audio of a recording between Charle and this Katherine Magbanua, and thought that this amplification of the audio, which makes it easier to hear what they were talking about, that provided the extra evidence to be able to arrest Charle now. So that's what they say about why they did it, and I think that's plausible. I think there was also, let me just add one other thing, there was also a reasonable strategy going on, perhaps by the district attorney's office, which is, as you know, often in these cases, you go after the lower level people in the scheme and hope that they flip or cooperate and testify against the higher level people. So they were hoping that this woman, the intermediary, Katherine Magbanua, would flip on Charle, would flip on the mom, Dana Adelson, and testify, and we're waiting for her to do that. She didn't end up doing that, but that's one argument about why they may have waited to arrest any members of the Adelson family.
You said something interesting in passing. You said that this guy Weinstein had helped Charle in the past when he got in trouble. Yeah. Was he getting in trouble for other things?
Yeah, Charle has been in trouble for various things over the years, and there's sort of little pieces of evidence of that. Some of it's, kind of anecdotal, but you see in the evidence, there's a police report that came out during the development of this case that Charle had some trouble in dental school. I think he was caught cheating. I think he also wasn't showing up to his residency. And essentially, influential people at the dental school, there's in the police report an allusion to a judge, and that's allusion to this guy, Peter Weinstein, essentially weighing in with, I don't know if it's members of the board at the dental school, but kind of influential people at the dental school to sort of get Charle through and get Charle to be able to graduate, even though if he hadn't had that influence, he probably would have failed out and not graduated.
Think this guy Weinstein faces any legal jeopardy? Now, Carm, I thought you weren't interested in detective stories. Go ahead, Carm.
Okay. There is also, in passing, I didn't know because I didn't really delve into it, I confess. But there is an older brother. What is the family's relationship with the older brother? Where does he live? Does he have a family? I want to
Well,
know more about.
Jason alluded to this. Jason said he spoke out on behalf of the
Well,
Markels.
I want to.
What's his name? How old? What's his deal?
So the birth order is the person, the older brother, Rob Adelson. He's the oldest. Then Charlie, the middle one, who executed this murder, and then Wendi is the youngest. So Rob is the oldest. He's a doctor in Albany, New York. I think it's ear, nose, and throat doctor. In another podcast on this, over my dead body, he spoke out on this podcast, really questioning whether his family was involved. And I think it became clear from that podcast. He also talked about how his mother essentially interfered in a close relationship that he had and led him to not marry the woman he wanted to marry. And then he married someone else. And that marriage was short-lived. And then he got back together with the woman he's now married to. And so he is partly from that whole experience. And then more recently, because of the murder and his sort of knowledge that his family was involved, he is now, estranged from his family.
So a couple of minor but major points. So after the murder, Wendi, to pour salt in the proverbial wound, denied Dan's parents, whose names are Ruth and Phil Markel, the opportunity to visit or communicate with their grandkids. So it's my understanding, Jason, that since 2014, Dan's parents have not been in contact with their own grandchildren, and Wendi changed their last name from Markel to Adelson. Is this true?
That's basically right. The one slight modification is that it's since 2016 that they haven't been able to see their grandkids. Essentially, it was once that it became public, all the evidence pointing to Charlie and Dana Adelson as the people who brought about Dan's murder. That's when she cut off contact with Dan's parents. Just recently, in response to a bill passed by the Florida legislature to try to get the Markels' rights to see their kids, Wendi did allow them to see the boys just for an hour recently. But that may have been an attempt to stave off more consequences for her.
How old are the boys?
The boys are now, I think, 13 and 12 or 13 and 11, something like that. And so for this whole last 6-7 years, these formative years, not only did they lose their father, but they were cut off from their grandparents and also from their cousins. So, first cousins I've found in my life, maybe you all have found in yours, can be such important relationships. And they have first cousins who are older than them, both in this older brother Rob's family and in Dan's sister's family, who they don't know because they've been cut off from them by Wendi.
As a jurist, as a
legal scholar himself,
legal scholar, how is it possible? What did the murdered husband's parents do to be punished like that?
I'll tell you what. Their son married a psychopath. That's the answer. Nothing. That's what it comes down to.
No, but legally, I'm not interested emotionally.
Oh, you're legally.
Dan?
So
Jason.
legally, grandparents in most states have very few rights. So parents get to decide pretty much, everything about their kids and what their kids can do and who their kids can see. And grandparents have very few rights. That's one reason why my organization, Justice for Dan, particularly through the leadership of my partner in Justice for Dan, Karen Cyphers, helped get through the legislature and pass a bill that would give grandparents like the Markels rights to see their kids. But these rights are only in very limited circumstances.
So this law that was passed in the Florida state legislature was in direct reaction to what happened to Dan's parents' inability to see their grandchildren?
Direct reaction. It was the effort of Dan's parents, our organization, Justice for Dan, working with some terrific lobbyists in Tallahassee and some terrific state legislators who were able to get interested in this tragic story, we passed this bill. But it only triggers the rights if the parent is either convicted of a crime or is successfully sued in a wrongful death lawsuit. And so since the Markels, at least to date, have not brought such a lawsuit, and Wendi has not been convicted of anything, today, as we speak, the Markels still don't have the rights to see those kids. And that's why they've only seen them for an hour in the last 6 years.
Now, the Markels, as far as I understand, they've never spoken about this publicly, only through their family attorney. Have you talked to them, and how are they doing, and what's their mindset?
I have talked to Dan's mom, Ruth, from time to time over the years. And, you can imagine this is an unimaginable tragedy to lose a child, and to lose a child in this way. And then to be cut off from your grandkids, your last living connection to your son, and to not be able to help guide them and help have any relationship with them, particularly when you know that they are now being raised by this pathological family. It's just compounds the grief, and it's just unbelievably devastating. But, they, and particularly, Ruth has been doing what she can to fight for justice in different ways.
And Jason,
this is the most absurd part of the story. The most absurd part of the story. These laws vary from state to state on the rights of, because I'm a grandparent.
Be careful, Carm. You have limited rights. Be very careful.
No, do they vary from state to state?
Yes, they do. They vary from state to state. Yeah.
Now, Jason, without being modest, obviously you're a very strong legal mind. You're a law professor at one point. Your partner in this, I assume, in Justice for Dan, as an attorney. What part have you guys had in moving this case forward legally, making sure that I's are dotted and T's are crossed? Because you're not just your regular Joes. You guys come in here with legal firepower.
Yeah, well, I'd say, let me separate that into two parts. There's the bill that we just talked about, the grandparents' rights bill. And I think on that, we did have a significant role. And again, we is really all my partner, Karen Seifert, who's not an attorney, but who works in politics, who's worked in government in Tallahassee and politics and communications, and is very skilled and well-connected in getting things done in Florida politics and government. And so she really did play a lead role in that. In terms of the legal case itself and the prosecution, I think we've played a more minor role, but what we've tried to do is demonstrate to the district attorney's office, and of course, the district attorney, as in many places, is elected, and try to highlight in local and national media that we're not going away, that public attention to this case is not going away. And to the extent that in the past, the district attorney may have been nervous or persuaded not to take on the Adelsons. Maybe they thought, hey, we don't want to take on this powerful family in Miami, and they're going to hire these high-priced lawyers, and then, maybe we're going to lose, and that will look bad for us. And what we've tried to say is, no, look, you can't just let this fade away. Rich people can't get away with murder just because they can pay people to do their dirty work for them and pay high-priced lawyers to defend them. You need to really go after these people and hold them accountable. So I think we played a modest role in helping to keep that public pressure and public attention on. And then, frankly, people like you and other members of all different kinds of media who have continued to bring attention to this, I think has played an important role in making sure that everyone who was involved in this murder is held accountable.
Farm, let me test you again. Do you know the price tag for the hitmen? Do you know what the hitmen were paid for this?
I saw the number. I know she got the boob job.
That's a very Florida twist, but the price tag for the hitman, I believe, was $100,000.
Like small amount relatively for a human life, relatively speaking.
There is no price for human life. What was your question, Carm?
Now I forgot, but wait a second. And
While you're thinking of that, so there's a lot more.
I have a senior moment every single
There are
session.
a lot of twists and turns. So I believe a couple of years ago, so the feds are.
I know.
Okay, go ahead, Carm.
No, it's really a very side story, but I'm curious. Wendi was a young woman when this happened in 2014. She already had a boyfriend who was also in the legal profession. What is she doing now? Is she living with her parents? Is she in South Florida? Am I going to bump into her?
She's planning her future husband's murder.
No, am I going to bump into her at the Aventura Mall?
Yeah, probably.
What is she? Does she have another boyfriend? What do you know anything about her?
I don't know. What I know is she is living on her own with her kids in, I think, Miami Beach, but I'm not positive.
Oh God!
Definitely in South Florida, in the area. I'd
Kids
be
probably
surprised
go
if
to
she
my
wasn't
kid's
still.
school.
Her kids probably go to his kids' school.
I wouldn't doubt it.
Who knows? And I think the other thing that we know is she has, she was an immigration lawyer. She now, or at least as until very recently, worked at a place called Vault Health, where she is interestingly in charge of legal operations. And, she's now been publicly named as a co-conspirator in this murder. And it'll be interesting how long she can actually last as someone who's in charge of legal compliance at a big company, being a co-conspirator for murder. It's a little unusual that a co-conspirator for murder is in that role. And I wonder if with continued public attention to her and her role in this murder, whether she'll be continued to have a legal career.
If there's any, I mean, there isn't, but if there was any sort of silver lining in this whole story, is the absolute agony that Dana Adelson and Wendi Adelson must live in every second, knowing that the long arm of the law is coming to get them, and they will get them, and they will get them very soon, I think. Because I mean, Jason, you know this more than me, but now with Charle Adelson in custody, they're going to lean on him hard, right? The prosecution is going to lean on him hard to try to get him to give up information about his sister or his mother, right?
I think it's I would assume so. I think it's an interesting question about what they would offer Charle for him to do that. I mean, he's obviously either the most culpable or among the most culpable of any of them. But I think they have plenty of evidence to charge Dana Adelson, the mother, right now. I don't think they really need his testimony for that. I do think the interesting question is whether he flips on Wendi. Is he really going to go down for this thing that, at least in his mind, he did for his sister? And he's sitting there in jail in Tallahassee. He ain't getting out anytime soon. I'm very skeptical that any judge is going to let him out on bond, given the overwhelming evidence against him, plus the access to money. He'll just flee the country. And any judge will know that. So he's sitting there in jail in Tallahassee. Wendi and Dana, his mother and sister, and his father for that matter, and I think you're right that most likely all of them were involved. All of them knew about it in some sense. They're scared every day, but still they're living their life free in South Florida. And is he really going to let that happen and take the fall for the whole family? That's the question right now.
Okay,
if he was a man, he would at least do that.
This is the psychology where I have to come in, and I am notorious in minding my children's business. Okay, and I think Wendi went a step further. Like she tried to break up the oldest son's marriage. She tried to. The second son is not married, never was married, right?
Yep.
He's not gay because he had a girlfriend.
He's a playboy. He's a spoiled brat.
How old is he?
Mid-40s.
Mid-40s. Mid-40s. The daughter was the princess, and she ran her too in a certain way. And that will warn me not to carry my talents of domineering my family too far.
Carm, the scariest thing about this story personally is the fact that that umbilical cord was very tight, and my umbilical cord is tighter, and it's more a matter
He's
of...
the victim. He's the second child.
Now, on to... so there are more twists and turns in all this. Jason, by the way, is obviously a very high IQ guy who's wondering about our relationship right now.
Why did he ever get involved in this?
In this. But so there are more twists and turns. So the feds get involved in this. And this was fascinating. This happened on Miami Beach, where we live, Carm, where a guy posing as the brother of one of the hitmen approaches Dana and says, listen, the thing that you wanted done, my brother's having a hard time and he's going to need some financial help. They were trying to... I have to be careful with my... I was going to say entrap, but that legally is not the correct word. They were trying... Correct. They were trying to see what they could get. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So Dana, the mother, when the FBI agent came up undercover, she really didn't give anything up. But this triggered family conversations, and this is what Jason was talking about at the beginning. The woman who's now on trial, Katherine Magbanua, who again... is the baby mama of one of the hitmen and also the ex-girlfriend of Charle Adelson. She, after this, had a conversation with Charle Adelson. And at first, the prosecutors, the people looking at the evidence in this case, could not make out the audio. But then the audio was enhanced, right, Dan? I mean, right, Jason? I apologize. And then
that's right.
When the audio was enhanced, that led eventually to the arrest of Charle, correct?
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
And so just to kind of round things out, so the two hitmen already went on trial. Garcia got sentenced to life, right?
That's right.
And Rivera, what is his sentence?
His sentence was, I'm not going to get exactly right, it was only like 5 or 6 years, but it's concurrent on a longer sentence. So, he's not getting out of jail anytime soon.
And he was a member of the Latin Kings. And so now,
right.
As you're listening to this, and it'll be wrapping up because we put the podcast out a week later, Katherine Magbanua, the Charle Adelson's girlfriend and the baby mama of the hitman, she's on trial for murder, right? So she faces life in prison as well?
That's right.
Okay. And then now the missing pieces of the puzzle. Charle, as you mentioned, the brother, he's sitting in jail in Tallahassee. Is there a court date for his trial yet?
There is not. There is not a court date. So we'll see when that is tried. And again, we'll see if he is really going to take this to trial, given that he is not a super sympathetic defendant. There's lots of evidence against him. And, I think one question, as we talked about before, is what kind of deal would the prosecutors offer him in exchange for testimony against his sister? And would he go for that?
What kind of deal do you think what kind of deal could he make potentially? Let's say he gives up his sister. I mean, what kind of time is he looking at in prison if he gives up his sister?
I mean, I really don't know. Would he and the prosecution go for a deal of 20 years instead of life in prison? 15? I don't know, 10. If you're asking me, 10 seems a bit short for engineering this whole murder. But I don't know.
And then, as far as you know, is there enough evidence, in your opinion, to convict or at least bring to trial both Dana, the mother, and Wendi, the ex-wife? Do you think there's enough there to bring charges against them?
I think there's enough against Dana. I don't think there's enough against Wendi. I think there's plenty of evidence against Dana because there's evidence of her hatred of Dan, and there's evidence of her going back and forth in the cell phone records. Essentially, you can see in the cell phone records, every time something significant happens, the night before the murder, the day of the murder, after the murder, the pattern is Charle calls his mom, they talk, then Charle calls Katie Magbanua, they talk, then Katie Magbanua calls Garcia, the hitman, and her, So, and let's also remember Donna, the mom, wrote checks out of the family dental practice to Katie Magbanua after the murder for more than a year for essentially a no-show job. Essentially, she made it look like Katie Magbanua looked at the dental practice, wrote, checks for like $400 at a time, totaling, I think, up to $55,000. There's no evidence that Katie ever worked at that dental practice. In fact, she worked at a different dental practice.
Carm, would you have made that dumb mistake? Never leave a paper trail, Carm. Never. So
if I didn't do it in 82 years, I don't think I'll do it now.
Now, the irony in all this is when the dust finally settles, more than likely, Donna, and if you're listening, you should be very worried. And it brings me, I'm a sick guy, but it brings me joy to know that they're living in fear right now, and they should be. But when the dust settles, there's a very high probability that the people that will get away with it are the father, Harvey, with whatever participation he had, and ironically, Dan's ex-wife, Wendi. They'll likely get away with it.
Sure.
I think there's a good chance of that. I think the only possibility of anything different happening is if Charlie flips on Wendi and his dad. And I think that's possible.
From a legal standpoint, I'm interested in this. Let's say Charlie says, my dad wanted me to do this and my sister was involved. From a prosecutorial standpoint, do you need anything else, or is his word, couldn't the defense come and say he's just making this up? Like, how do you prove that in a court of law?
I think his word is good enough. His word, combined with possibly other things. There's, for example, some evidence that one of the hitmen, Garcia, called Harvey, the dad's phone, a few times at critical times. So I think the combination of those things would be enough.
But Joel, you just put something on Facebook about the last decision.
The last decision a Jewish
man
husband will ever make is marrying his wife. Something along those lines. That was a meme I saw. And your point, Carm?
The point is that Harvey, I can just see him being very passive, and going along with his wife's. That's my fantasy.
Well,
this has nothing to do with the reality, but that's how I see the family dynamics.
There's always
that's right.
What?
That's right.
Yeah,
Right?
there's always
it's pretty clear. That's right. Yep.
And there's always bad apples, but I don't know, these people stink to high heaven, as Geraldo Rivera would say. And
no, it's a bad combination of power, money, and pathology.
Yeah, and it all power, pathology, and we need another P for money for alliterative purposes. But anyway, they're getting what comes to them. Jason, how do we help you? What can the audience do? You have a website called Justice for Dan, is that right?
That's right. We have a website. Sorry, my internet's going out. We have a website. We have a Facebook page, Justice for Dan, and the audience can go there, follow us. Sometimes we've had petitions to sort of urge the district attorney, for example, to charge the Adelsons. So just continue to follow us, and we appreciate everyone's interest.
Jason, you're a mensch and a scholar, literally, and you're doing God's work by helping get justice for Dan. And when you speak to Ruth Markel, please send our regards, and we hope that there is justice in this case. Carm, any closing thought, comment?
Yeah, I agree with you. Being a grandmother, I really feel for the Markels, because that's the absurdity of the absurd, to first murder the father, then don't let the children see their grandparents. That's, like, to me, really crazy. The right thing would be not to see these monsters. Not to see this family.
I'll close it out with this. What's interesting, Jason has written blogs, and one of the blogs that I read, Jason talks, and he could say this, but I will say it for him right now. He talks about how these kids are going to soon be teenagers. They're going to read all about this case. They're going to see that their mother was a horrible human being, and they'll probably want nothing to do with her. So this is really a tragedy for the boys as well. I think their names are Ben and Lincoln. They're going to find out. Their father was murdered. Their mother's a psycho.
Their
grandmother
grandpa-
was a psycho. Their uncle was a psycho. And their tragedy comes from every direction. So,
They have one good uncle who lives in Albany.
and I'll probably bump into them at Lerman at the school my
Yeah,
kids
yeah.
go to. But Jason, absolute pleasure. If there's any way, obviously we wish we were talking about a different circumstance, but if there's a way we can help, please let us know, okay?
And we really appreciate your work. Really do.
Ab-
Because this is just
Absolutely. I appreciate your having me.
Okay, great. We'll be right back with the New Schmooze.
Welcome back. It's time for the News Schmooze.
Carm, we had you spitting out a Ricola live on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and we made a little reel of it. And believe it or not, Ricola responded on Instagram.
the company, the Swiss company.
Those Swiss bastards responded. And you know what they said? That you could enjoy it twice since you put it into a napkin.
No, I didn't put it into a napkin. I put it back into its own wrapper because we started our session.
Right, but they said that you could take it out of the wrapper and enjoy it for a second time. But the reason I bring it up is I feel like this is the one time in my life I actually need a Ricola. I would ask you about Jason Solomon and the whole saga, the Dan Markel story, but we have not interviewed him yet, and I'm not going to go down that road. We do that every week, so we're going to do the News Schmooze here. Remember last week we talked about the first time in 50 years that lawmakers were going to have a hearing on UFOs?
Yeah, that was our guy.
That was our guy, Dr. Avi Loeb was one of them. Well, it happened. It finally happened. Key lawmakers warned at a House hearing just yesterday that unidentified aerial phenomena, it's funny, so the government calls it UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, popularly known as UFOs. They say that they must be investigated and taken seriously as a potential threat to national security. This event marked the first congressional public hearing on UFOs in decades, a high-profile moment for a controversial topic that has long been relegated to the fringes of public policy. What's interesting is that these hearings in Congress, they go on for days. Nothing happens. You sit there, you fall asleep, you look at Steny Hoyer, if he's still alive, and he's nodding off. This one lasted all of 90 minutes. Whew, man, it's definitely not COVID. I took a COVID test. It came back negative, but I'm having trouble breathing.
Can I just?
Yeah.
What's interesting?
Yeah.
You know, I said that I'm like not up. I'm a little on the downside.
Yes.
And I know now where it started. For some reason, I won't say what happened with Roy yesterday and today. Nothing major. He's okay. But I started to think.
You know, we're
and
right in the
it's-
middle of the News Schmooze.
I don't care.
Uh.
It's very dangerous to think because suddenly I thought of this. Here we are on this tiny little planet of very non-existent significance
Mhm.
in an unbelievably gigantic cosmos that we cannot even grasp. And we are so small that from my upper floor apartment, the people downstairs look like ants. And here we are making these unbelievable dramas. We are here for for the blink of an eye, and then we are gone, like we never exist. So these cheerful, upbeat thoughts created my down feeling.
Beautiful.
Thank
By the
you.
way, you got your first harsh criticism on a YouTube comment.
I wouldn't call it harsh.
From a Brit. And the reason I know he's a Brit is he referred to you as Mum.
Mum.
And he said that during the Ghislaine Maxwell, William Steele episode that you were, quote unquote, interrupting the guest too much and it aggravated him.
No. He said he couldn't find out who stooped whom.
Yeah, well, we need to respect the guest and not cut them off, which
I
includes
think it's
the
an
host.
excellent criticism and excellent suggestion.
Back to the unidentified aerial phenomenon. So Democratic Rep. Andre Carson of Indiana, the chairman of the panel holding the hearing, he warned in opening remarks that unidentified aerial phenomena are a potential national security threat. They need to be treated that way. He went on to say, for too long, the stigma associated with UAPs has gotten in the way of good intelligence analysis. Pilots avoided reporting or were laughed at when they did. Department of Defense officials relegated the issue to the back room or swept it under the rug entirely, fearful of a skeptical national security community. Today we know better. UAPs are unexplained, it's true, but they are real. They need to be investigated, and any threats they pose need to be mitigated. I'll ask you again, Carmen, I've asked you before. Do you believe that there is alien life nearby or even on this planet?
I told you this before. I went on record that there is life on other planets if they have the similar conditions to ours.
What's interesting, though,
they have
is
oxygen, they have the right temperature. We are very delicate, a little up, little down, and we're out.
But what if it's something like, what if there's alien life, but let's say they're just rectangles or parabolas?
If you want to fall in love with one of them, you'll have to love rectangles.
No, I'm just saying, like, we assume that if there's extraterrestrial life, it's going to look and feel like humans, right?
It's not.
What if an extraterrestrial life is something we've never even seen before?
And no, but it could be something that we see all the time, but we never realize that it's extraterrestrial. It's kind of...
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I want to get a guest on this show about ufology, someone who studies this. There are a lot
ufology?
of ufology is this whole study. You never heard of that?
I never heard the term.
Like psychology, there's ufology, yeah. On to the next story. This one I picked specifically for you.
Thank you. It's romantic.
A couple in India is suing their son, and it says here a couple in India.
Because he didn't give them children.
Here it says a couple in India are suing, but I think it's a couple in India is suing because a couple is singular, correct?
The mother and father are suing the son.
I need a grammar expert to let me know. Anyway, a couple in India is suing their son and daughter-in-law for not giving them grandchildren after 6 years of marriage. Sadhana and Sanjeev Prasad, who live in Haridwar, a city in North Uttarakhand state, filed a petition this month seeking 50 million Indian rupees, which is about $643,000 in damages from their son, 35, and his wife, 31. The petition, which was actually viewed by CNN, claims the married couple, spent about 20 million Indian rupees, or $257,000, raising their son, who is an only child. They say in this petition that they raised him, educated him, made him capable, made him a pilot, which was expensive. And the couple's legal representative, Arvind Srivastava, say that they see people in their neighborhood playing with their grandchildren and feel like they should also have one. And they say that as a couple ages, there is no one to take care of them. This is the parents. And that all parents wish to be grandparents one day. How do you feel,
right, Joel.
How do you feel about this?
Joel. Okay,
you were almost this couple. You were almost this couple.
How was I almost?
I almost didn't have kids.
Well, I had 5 granddaughters.
Yeah, but that's not the same.
May I say something?
In all fairness to my nieces.
May I say something? I already thank you. Every day you expect a phone call to thank you for the grandkids.
The greatest thing I ever did in my life was have children.
No, have these children.
Yeah, my kids are wild, man. They behaved really well in LA for a 24-hour trip. What did you think of Zizi at her talent show?
Oh, I wish we could show the video.
My daughter did, her kindergarten class did it was a show like through the decades, and she was the 1920s, right?
Yeah, and she was great.
She sang a song called Baby, Oh Baby.
Yeah, something.
She twirled an umbrella, bring a tear to my eye. On to the third story. A team from Kyoto University, do you know where that is, Carm?
Yeah, in Japan.
Very good. Found that cats not only recognize their own names, but also show that they can match up names with the faces of other cats that they're familiar with. The findings point to cats having the same ability to learn human words that dogs display, even if cats would rather have their owners think that they're ignoring them. And one of the things that they were able to come to this conclusion with or about is that when they would stump the cat with a name, the cat would just stare at them. Like it would be a longer stare, as though they were a little confused.
May I say something?
It's funny because Matt Brode had a cat named Ari, which we switched it to Ira, which then became Iris. And all Iris would do for his entire life on this earth for 19 years was just stare into space. But all along, it turns out he knew his name. You'd call his name, he would just stare into space.
May I say something to you?
Yes.
You just overlooked something very significant.
Which I'm having trouble breathing today. What?
Kyoto is in Japan.
Yes.
Those were Japanese cats. If they can speak Japanese, they are more than geniuses.
It's amazing.
If they understand Japanese commands, and they must be very well, the generation to generation just developed amazingly. They probably speak English very easily.
This reminds me of a funny story unrelated to cats, but related to Japan. And if this happened today, she'd be canceled. But the fact that she was a drunk pill-popping anchor 10 years ago, she was able to get away with it. And that is Diane Sawyer. After this tsunami in Japan, the face of ABC News, Diane Sawyer, she went and she didn't realize she was doing it, but she was speaking like Japan English to the Jap. So she was like, "How do you feel?" Like Diane Sawyer was going, "How do you feel that the water ran you over? How do you feel?" And it was so racist and inappropriate. And if that happened today, by the way, I read that Matt Lauer just sold his house in Hamptons, and I was reading it to Ileana, selling it for $50 million. She's like, "I forgot that guy existed." You told me that news is like chutes and ladders. One day you're up, one day you're down. The guy was on the cover of People magazine, who was the biggest news anchor in America. You think he would rather have the money or rather work?
I think he would rather work.
You think he's upset?
Yeah.
You think it ruined his life?
People like fame.
You think Matt Lauer's life was ruined by this?
Very honestly, yes.
Thank God. Love to hear that. Okay.
What a bitter little boy.
We'll be right back with 3 questions for Grandma.
It's time now for 3 questions for Grandma.
And today, 3 questions for Grandma morphed into 4 questions for Grandma, which is interesting because last week it was 2 questions for Grandma. So if we average it out, we're still at 3 questions.
You have a love child hidden somewhere.
By the way, when we were in LA, Vita Aaliyah, my soon-to-be 8-year-old's front tooth.
Soon-to-be. She's literally 8 years.
Her front tooth came out, and she knows I'm the tooth fairy. So I put it in my pant pocket. And then I was so delirious when I got home. I was sure I put it in this drawer. When I went to look at the drawer this morning, it was not there. So I do not know where this tooth is. And she's been asking me, and trust me, she will not let this go. The only saving grace is if the tooth goes through the washing machine with my pants, it'll be fine, right? It was her front tooth. She's very obsessed about this.
Okay.
Okay, question.
Well, the whole world gives a damn.
3 questions for Grandma. First question from Vita. The first 2 questions are for Vita Aaliyah. How do people get a phone number? She's very worried about this, and she wants to know if she can get a phone number now without a phone. And she wants to know if I know the number.
Listen, I want to name my ninth grandchild without having a grandchild. When you get a phone, you get a phone number with it. It's assigned, I guess, arbitrarily in order. If the number 8 was used already, they have to do a 9. So it's an arbitrary decision on the number, but you cannot get a phone number without having a phone. You can have a car without knowing how to drive, but not a phone number without a phone.
By the way, I got in a habit. I can only sleep with a shirt over my eyes. I do not like any ambient light. But last night, my nose was running so much, and I couldn't get up.
Joel, the guy is going to call
that
me.
I started blowing my nose into the shirt, and it was
and then you wore it.
And then I wore it. I'm thinking about that now because I need a tissue, but not
You are
right
a
now.
real pig. Here is the tissue.
Did you use this tissue?
I don't think so.
You're giving me a used tissue?
No, I never used it. I checked.
It looks like it's used. On to question number 2, also from Vita Aaliyah. Her grammar is not perfect on this one, but I wrote it down the way she asked it. How did dogs hear so good? Should really be well.
I know. Because nature, and I think it's related to what is it called?
I could have a jackhammer in the house and Mabel wouldn't hear it. She's almost 17.
Wait a second. What is
Nature and
evolution?
nurture?
No, evolution. For the need of hunting, the hearing developed much better.
What's amazing about Mabel, I'll give you an example. To wean myself off of sweets, I have a few M&Ms every night. She's dead.
Yeah, like pills to neutralize.
She's dead asleep last night. I unzipped the Ziploc M&M bag and she's awake from the smell. That's how good their scent is.
Yes.
On to the
It's evolutionary stuff.
On to the third question. This comes from J-Mac, who just turned 3 this weekend. This was interesting. When we got back, but by the way, when we flew to LA, we flew out of Miami because Ileana wanted to save money. She's like, let's not spend Uber.
That was too funny. You should save that video that you made.
But we landed, she failed to tell me, in Fort Lauderdale. So it was a convoluted trip back home. We had to go, and our minivan was in the shop. When we got to the little things that we take for granted,
Joel,
I have time. The little things that we take for granted, like the minivan, being at the mechanic shop, you and I just sit there and go and pick up the car. But for Judah Mack, his jaw dropped. He could not believe he was seeing a vroom vroom hospital, as I described it. And he then asked today, why do vroom vrooms get sick? You have an answer for him.
Yes. Actually, it's not a hospital because they're not live. You use the term of live people for hospitals. This is a place and machines break. Human beings get sick, machines break. They react differently. And these are places where you fix.
By the way, Miami and Austin are the two cities. There's a company called Argo, and they are driverless taxis. And they just started without drivers, actually doing like pickups, not actually, whatever the word I'm looking for is. They're not actually picking real passengers up yet, but they're starting to drive. They had a driver in there. Now there's no driver is what I'm trying to say. Last question.
This is reassuring.
This comes from ZZ Bugs. This was an interesting question. She says, why do candles take a while to melt? In other words, when you light the wick, why doesn't it just melt to the ground right away? Why does it take time?
That's a fabulous question.
Interesting.
Wow, I have no idea why is it going so progressively.
Guess it's just the wick takes time to burn would be my guess.
No idea, dear. I really don't know. Who could we ask? Are there candologists?
I usually just ask Steve Isaacoff.
Okay.
Who's got an MD, PhD from Princeton and Harvard. Anyway, Carm, how do you like the podcast? It's now over. Until next week.
Well, I would have liked it if it wouldn't be in not the right order and we didn't interview the main person yet.
We're about to do that. All right. Love you, America.
Love you, America. Goodbye.
Bye.